that concerns me in this video says that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the sentiment of the person who is assessing that action. A sentiment of approval means that the action is right. A sentiment of disapproval means that the action is wrong. The 18th century philosopher David Hume starts with this, but ends up with a view that's quite a bit more complex. There's a problem with any theory that bases moral value on sentiment. How do you get different people with different sentiments at different times to come to the same moral judgment? Sentiments appear to be a biological reaction to perception or belief. Different people can react differently to the same perception or belief, and our sentiments are sometimes affected by things that aren't morally relevant. We have a different sentiment to the assault of a close friend or family member than we do to an identical assault committed against a stranger on the other side of the world. However, identical assaults should get the same moral assessment. Hume's theory begins with standard assessor relativism. What makes an act wrong, for example, is that the assessor has a sentiment of disapproval towards the action. In a very famous, often quoted passage, at least among those who study moral philosophy, Hume wrote, quote, "Take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder for instance. Examine it in all lights, and see if you can find the matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You never can find it until you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you towards the action." Unquote. But that can't be all there is to it. You can't come upon a body in an alley, discover whether you have a sentiment of disapprobation or not, and determine from that whether a murder has taken place. Assume that you do discover a body in an alley. It has a bullet wound. It was shot in the back. Your initial sentiment may tell you that a murder has taken place. However, you discover that a surveillance camera captured the event. It shows a person pulling some adolescent into an alley. It shows a struggle where the assailant dropped a gun. The teenager picked up the gun. The assailant then saw the teenager aim the gun at him and turned away just as the teenager pulled the trigger. Then the teenager ran away in terror. As we learn more about the case, our sentiments change. This suggests that the sentiment that determines whether or not something is wrong is not the sentiments that we have, but the sentiment we would have if we knew all of the relevant facts. Hume allows that, as a part of his theory, incorrect beliefs can lead sentiments astray. He wrote, quote, "A person may be affected with passion by supposing a pain or pleasure to lie in an object, which has no tendency to produce either of these sensations, or which produces the contrary to what is imagined." End quote. What Hume is talking about here is the possibility that mistaken beliefs about something can bring about a rise of sentiment that is, in a sense, incorrect. A person may take pride in winning a contest that a wealthy and powerful relative has rigged by bribing judges, making the victory seem like a personal accomplishment, when in fact it's not. It's not the passions that one finds when one turns one's attention to one's own breast that determines wrongness of something. It's the passions one would find if one turns one's attention to one's own breast under the conditions that one knew all of the relevant facts of the case. Mistaken beliefs about the object of moral evaluation are not the only cause of error. If a person isn't careful, the possibility of personal benefit or loss can also corrupt our judgments about what's right or wrong. A less careful thinker will see what benefits them as right and what harms them as wrong. Hume wrote, quote, "It is only when a character is considered in general, without reference to our particular interest, that it causes such a feeling or sentiment as denominates it morally good or evil." End quote. These refinements, when one is fully informed and impartial, removes some of the problems with naive subjectivism, which takes one's sentiments of approval or disapproval on face value. There's a significant possibility of error, and even though right and wrong is based on sentiments, an individual's sentiment can be mistaken. This happens when one is mistaken about some of the relevant facts. It also happens when personal interests of benefit or harm cloud moral judgments. So a moral judgment comes from an attitude of approval or disapproval when a fully informed and unbiased agent judges what? What does morality judge? In answer to this question, Hume tells us, quote, "It is evident that when we praise any actions, we regard only the motives that produced them, and consider the actions as signs or indications of certain principles in the mind or temper." Unquote. In other words, our moral evaluations are founded on sentimental responses, fully informed and unbiased, of the motives or character traits of the individual as revealed by their action. When we come upon our body in the alley, our moral evaluations ultimately concern the character of the person whose body we found and of the teenager that shot him. If you're trying to determine whether somebody who killed another acted in self-defense or committed willful murder, you look to determine the agent's motives. Was the agent acting to protect an innocent person from an attack? Or was the person seeking to cause harm out of revenge or a hope to profit? Let's review the problem that we're trying to solve, and then look at Hume's proposed solution. The problem is that moral evaluations are based on sentiments. People with different sentiments come to different moral judgments. But it's not the sentiment that one has that determines moral value. It's the sentiment one would have if one was unbiased and fully informed. But it still seems unlikely that different people, even if fully informed and unbiased, will find themselves in agreement. So Hume introduces another step. We are to evaluate these character traits, these motives, from what Hume calls the common point of view. Hume wrote, quote, "But we shall easily satisfy ourselves on this head when we consider that every particular person's pleasure and interest being different, it is impossible men could ever agree on their sentiments and judgments unless they choose some common point of view, from which they might survey their object and which might cause it to appear the same to all of them." End quote. Hume further says that, from this common point of view, where we're evaluating motives, we are to consider only the interests of the person whose actions we are evaluating and those who must interact with that person. Hume wrote, quote, "Now in judging of characters, the only interest or pleasure which appears the same to every spectator is that of the person himself whose character is examined, and that of persons who have a connection with him." End quote. Since these, as well as the fully informed beliefs of the assessor, are in all cases the same, all evaluators should end up with the same conclusion. Consequently, Hume's form of subjectivism ends up with all agents reaching the same judgment. Evaluations are still based on sentiment. It's the sentiment one would have if fully informed and imagining away all personal bias, looking at the situation from the common point of view. So does this actually solve the problem Hume is trying to solve? Will different assessors have the same sentiment? We have two options to look at. Option one, the evaluation is based on the sentiment that the individual would have under those circumstances. Option two, the evaluation is based on the sentiment that an imagined hypothetical, fully informed, unbiased individual looking from the common point of view would have in those circumstances. Let's look at the first option, where the sentiment used, in this case, is that of the individual making the judgment. Hume has told us that different people will be evaluating the same action based on the same interests, which are those of the agent and those who interact with the agent, and all assessors are fully informed, so their judgment will all be based on the same information. Because if all of these things are the same, Hume tells us that all individuals will have the same sentiment. But the sentiment itself is a biological reaction to these beliefs. And that sentiment can still be different from one individual to another. There's no reason to believe that different assessors are biologically identical. Nor is there any reason to believe that the same assessor will maintain the same relevant biological reactions over time. Consequently, it doesn't seem reasonable to expect that there will be a single uniform answer to any moral question. Different assessors will still arrive at different answers, and the same assessor will arrive at different answers at different times as they age. So let's turn to the second option. The sentiment is that of a hypothetical individual. One thing to note is that on Hume's account, no person, hypothetical or otherwise, can use reason alone to get to the correct answer. It must be found in sentiment. The fact that the judgment is grounded in sentiment rather than reason is what makes it a sentimentalist theory. This means we must determine which sentiments this hypothetical individual would have in order to determine how this individual would react. A hypothetical individual without sentiment wouldn't make any judgment. They would be completely indifferent. But what's the correct sentiment? Well, look at it this way. Different individuals would reach different judgments because they have different sentiments grounded on different biological facts. To give this hypothetical individual the correct sentiment, we're first going to have to determine the correct biology. But there is no correct biology. Assuming that this first problem can be solved, there's a second problem. There's no reason for any individual to bind their actions to the sentiment-based judgments of this hypothetical individual. One of Hume's arguments for a sentiment-based theory is that moral judgments influence actions. But it's only the agent's actual judgments that influence the agent's actual actions. The hypothetical judgments of a hypothetical entity would have no effect on an individual unless the individual also had some sentiment motivating it to do what the hypothetical entity would judge to be obligatory, or not do what the hypothetical entity would judge to be wrong. We have two ways of interpreting Hume's response to the problem of naive subjectivism. The first doesn't allow for uniform judgments. Different individuals have different biologies and will have different reactions to the same facts. The second seems to require an arbitrary decision regarding the correct biology to determine a uniform correct judgment, and can't account for how that judgment would be binding on real people. To deal with some of the problems with naive subjectivism, Hume has given us a more sophisticated version of subjectivism. On this view, you can't trust your actual sentiments to give you moral knowledge. You would have to become fully informed of all of the relevant facts, and you need to abstract away all personal benefits or harms, not only to yourself, but to those you care about, before you can trust your sentiment to give you moral knowledge. But even this more sophisticated moral subjectivism seems to run into problems. It seems to require that everybody have the same biology so that everybody can have the same sentiment. And that seems to be an unreasonable requirement.